Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today we have a new watercolor painting tutorial where we'll paint this minimal style Japanese or Chinese art inspired scenery. I'm using a fairly small piece of watercolor paper. I felt like I didn't need too much space for the painting, so I cut this piece out of my Etchr sketchbook, and then I went ahead and taped it onto this cutting board that we're gonna use as a painting background. Before we get to the actual watercoloring part, we'll start by doing a very quick sketch where we'll mainly focus on the outline for the roof structure in the picture. I'm using colored pencils instead of a regular pencil, but both work completely fine. I'm gonna use these pencils in the later part of the video to add some final definition and outlines, so that's why I think it was only fitting to also use them for the sketching part. I know it's really hard to see anything in the video because I'm using quite a light hand here. With watercolors, there is always a chance that your sketch lines might show through the paint, which is why I'm trying to keep things fairly light. I'm also not really sketching most of the trees, but I did very lightly sketch some of these bigger flower branches that will be at the front of the painting, and then we're gonna add a few rock shapes in the bottom left corner. I'll show you a close-up of the sketch so that you can hopefully see everything a little bit more clearly, but after this is all done, we can jump straight to the painting part. I'm using a size 4 round brush for these first steps, and then we'll switch to a size 2 at some point, and these are the only brushes I'll use for the whole painting. The watercolors are from my trusty Winsor & Newton 24 pan set, and all the tools are also listed in the video description in case you wanna check something from there. I thought it would make sense to start with some light background elements like these leaf groups around the roof, because these colors are so light that they aren't disturbing any other colors we'll add on top. With watercolors, you usually want to start with the light colors or details that are at the front of the painting, and then progress to the darker colors and background elements later, because you can't really remove any dark colors you lay down. I was using a lot of wet on dry technique with this painting, which allows you to paint very small specific shapes with defined edges. So after some of these background leaf branches, we'll move on to the yellow flowers at the front. And generally, we're starting from some lighter yellows here too, and this will be the same for other parts in this painting. So you might want to start with some lighter, maybe a little bit looser shapes first, and then we can start to add more shadows and intensity to the colors by going over the same areas with a darker shade. I was trying to do some tapping motions here to create these tiny flower-looking dot groups, but I'm also trying not to paint any specific shapes here, so we are keeping these flowers more on the color blob level. I try to be a little bit more precise when we start to paint the leaves around these flowers. So again, it might be easier to start with some lighter leaves that you can almost add to the background. Doing that will just add a little bit fuller look to this area and give the appearance of some leaves between the branches and maybe further away. I'm also switching the green tones quite a bit here, and I'm not really following any specific rule for the color difference. So at times I'm just using a more olive toned green, and then I mixed it with this brighter grass green. And then to get the colors a little bit darker and more muted, I also mixed a little bit of this grayish blue color into the green tones. If you find it difficult to paint very precise shapes like this, don't worry about this step too much, because you can always make everything seem a bit sharper by adding an outline with either colored pencils or even with a black pen if you want to go for a little bit different look. If you're wondering which flowers these are, they are osmanthus flowers that are pretty common here in Japan. These have become some of my favorite flowers because they have an incredible scent, and just going out and smelling those flowers reminds me of Japanese fall. There will also be some of these flowers in my upcoming shop's fall collection, and I made this painting thinking that I might use it for the collection in some way. I probably won't make a big art print out of this, but maybe like a small, little bit cheaper one, or I might use it for the thank you card or something like that. I'll need to think about it. But anyway, after the flowers, we can then jump to this roof structure next. We're taking things step by step here as well. So first, I'm just adding pretty much a background layer to the roof and this wooden pillar. And again, I'm trying to mix some colors to add a little bit of variation in these shades. And then after these first layers have dried a bit, I'm starting to add more detail by painting these tile details with a slightly darker color. My tile rows didn't end up exactly even, which bothered me a little bit, but at the same time, I don't know if that's so noticeable in the final image. We'll keep adding further shadows and details to this roof later, but now I wanted to start painting this bigger tree branch that's gonna go on the left side of this whole picture. I wanted this to be a pretty big noticeable part in the image, also much darker than the tree leaves we added to the background, but we're again starting with these very light background layers. I think this is going to be a very good example of layering darker and darker colors on top of lighter ones, and how you'll be able to build that depth and intensity and add small details here and there using darker colors. It might be beneficial to have some kind of reference image that you can use to help you with the color differences. And I'm also using this smaller brush here to really keep these details as small as possible. I'm using a little bit more water for these first layers, which are lighter and more blown out. And then when we move on to the darker layers, I'm actually using quite a dry brush to keep adding this texture to the leaves. Dry brush often allows you to create very rough texture, which I think suits certain elements like leaves, for example. After layers upon layers of leaves and adding some brown branches as well, I was finally happy with this hanging branch. And then we can move on to the final part of this image, which are the rocks at the bottom left corner. I already added some color for the water here earlier, but we are also gonna darken that a little bit. But first I started by painting the rocks. I'm using the same technique here that we used earlier, so starting from the lighter background layers and then slowly starting to darken things up to add some detail. Again, I'm switching my colors here to add a bit more variation, so the upper parts of the rocks are maybe a little bit more brown toned, and then I started to add some more bluish gray and black towards the lower parts. I tried to keep the shapes a little bit more angular here to mimic the rough panels of rocks. And again, I think having some kind of reference picture would be very helpful here. It definitely is quite difficult to paint something like rocks just out of your imagination if you've never done that before. So never be scared to look for some guidance in terms of photographs or even other paintings. And then the very last step of this painting will be to add some more details and outlines with the colored pencils, as I mentioned earlier. I'm using some of my green and brown tones to add a bit of definition to these flowers first. It was very difficult to create defined shapes with these quite light colors, especially for the flowers. So if you feel like your shapes are kind of disappearing to the background, adding some very thin outlines might help you out. I also added a lot of lines and details to the roof structure because this was a place where colored pencils worked a little bit better than watercolors. Of course, you could always add these outlines and details with watercolors themselves, but I feel like the extra control you have with pencils really helps with these thin strokes. I also added a little bit of color and details to the branch here on the left side. And I feel like a lot that I'm doing at this point doesn't really show up in the video. It's very subtle, and maybe it would be easier to see the difference in a before and after picture rather than slowly seeing me add these lines everywhere. But I hope you at least still get the idea for why we're doing this. But after that, we're actually done with this painting. I really hope you enjoyed this quick painting session and seeing something in a little bit different style. I'll definitely still edit this picture on a computer and maybe add some details and fix the colors a bit if I decide to add this to my upcoming collection. But those are all things that are a little bit easier to do with more time on a computer rather than directly on the paper. But anyway, if this was your first time around here and you'd like to stay tuned for more art and journaling content, definitely consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a lovely day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye bye!